The north is cold and full of whispers.
The letter to Walder Frey was half-written. Tywin Lannister set down his quill and read what he had composed so far with the detached efficiency of a man reviewing a grain shipment order. The language was clean, direct. It carried the full weight of his seal without needing to announce itself. 3 centuries ago, a lesser man might have called it ruthless. Tywin called it surgery. You identified the rot, you cut it out, you did not hesitate between the decision and the blade. The Bolton confirmation sat sealed to his right, written in under 2 minutes that morning, before breakfast, before the council. 4 sentences, the specific instructions, the specific timing, the specific reward. He had not needed to read it again since. Outside the Tower of the Hand, King's Landing breathed beneath him. The city at night was never truly quiet. Too many people crammed too close together, too many fires, too many arguments bleeding through shuttered windows. But up here, in his solar, there was a quality of stillness that Tywin Lannister had cultivated across 40 years of governance. He did not require silence. He required concentration. He had learned long ago that these were different things. The arbor gold in his cup had gone warm. He picked up his quill to continue the Frey letter. He wrote 3 more words. Then something happened that Tywin Lannister had no framework for, no prior experience of, and no language to describe. Not then. Not yet. It was not pain. It was not sleep. It was closer to the experience of a man who has been staring at a map for so long that the distances cease to be abstract, who suddenly feels in his chest and his gut the actual weight of the leagues between armies, except instead of distance, what collapsed into him was time. Years, events, outcomes, arrived at without him, decided without him, each one wrong in ways he could not yet fully measure. His quill scratched a long, meaningless line across the parchment. His hand had stopped obeying him. The images did not arrive with sound. They had no beginning and no end. They arrived the way a master archivist places documents on a table, one after another, with cold and deliberate efficiency. As if someone had concluded that Tywin Lannister deserved no emotional cushion, no warning, no mercy, just the facts. Joffrey's face. Not the boy's face Tywin managed at court with the practiced tolerance of a man diffusing the same trap every morning. A wedding feast, not a battlefield, not a throne room, a wedding feast, with golden cups and Tyrell roses on every surface. His grandson's face going the color of a bruise, purple spreading from the throat outward, golden hair, green eyes. The boy clawing at his own neck with hands that had spent 3 years tormenting everyone within reach, and those same hands now finding nothing to grip, nothing to punish, nothing that could stop what was happening to him. Poisoned, at a celebration, by the people he believed were his allies. Then Cersei, older, standing on the cobblestones of King's Landing, not the Red Keep, not her chambers, the actual street, stripped of every stitch of silk the name Lannister had purchased for her. The crowd pressed close on both sides. Someone was ringing a bell. A voice, not one voice but dozens layered into something that sounded like a verdict, called a single word at her back as she walked, over and over. Shame, 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 and Cersei's face, and this was the detail that arrived with the force of something physical, landing somewhere behind Tywin's sternum. Cersei's face was not broken. She was still furious. She was still, in the precise way she had always been, his daughter. But there was nothing left to protect her. No gold, no walls, no name. He had given her all 3. She had spent them. Then fire. Not the green of wildfire, not the controlled blast at Blackwater that he had wielded as a hammer against Stannis' fleet. Something older, something that moved through the streets of King's Landing with the patience of a thing that had burned cities before and found the process unremarkable. Orange, red, and enormous, and coming from above, which was wrong, which was impossible, which meant something he did not immediately accept. Then the cold. The cold came last, and it came without fire, without sound, without any of the trappings that lesser minds use to signal danger. It was simply an army, moving south. The faces in it were faces of men he recognized from Night's Watch reports, Rangers, brothers, wildlings, and none of them were alive. The eyes were wrong, blue where they should have been brown or gray or green. Blue and flat and patient in the way that nothing living is ever patient, because the living always wants something, always have somewhere to be. These did not. They had forever. And they were going to use it. The candles had not moved. The arbor gold in his cup had not cooled further. He was still at his desk. The parchment bore a long, meaningless scratch where his quill had dragged. His hand was flat on the table. He did not remember placing it there. For 4 seconds, perhaps 5, Tywin Lannister did absolutely nothing. Then he began to think. He had spent 40 years building the Lannister name into something that fear and gold and war could not dislodge. He had done this because his father, soft, laughing, generous Tytos Lannister, had nearly collapsed everything in a single generation. Tywin had been 11 years old when he watched lords mock his family's sigil in his father's own hall. He had never forgotten what a house looked like when it lost the respect of the men who were supposed to serve it. Everything since had been the correction of that error. He thought about Joffrey. Not the boy's cruelty. He had always known about the cruelty. He had told himself, 3 years ago, that it was manageable. That boys became men. That a sufficiently controlled environment would sand the edges off what he had privately recognized, even then, as something closer to madness than temperament. He had been wrong. He had chosen to believe a comfortable fiction, and that fiction had just shown him its final chapter in the length of a single ugly moment at a wedding feast. He thought about Cersei. She was not stupid. That was the cruelest part of it. She was brilliant in the narrow way of a woman who had spent her entire life learning to navigate a world that refused to give her power directly and had therefore learned to take it sideways. He had respected that, privately, he had given her a king to shape and a court to manage, and she had raised a monster. Armed a religious army to preserve her own feelings, and spent 3 years making enemies of the only people positioned to protect her. She was not incompetent. She was brilliant the way fire is brilliant, tremendous heat, no direction, and it consumes the house that contains it. He thought about Tyrion. This one required the longest moment. Not because it wounded him. Tywin did not permit wounds in this particular direction, had not permitted them in 26 years, but because the calculation was the most damning of all. He had looked at his dwarf son and concluded, long ago, that the liability outweighed the asset, and what he had seen, in those flat archival seconds of future knowledge, was a man managing a burning city with the clarity of someone who understood that panic kills faster than fire, a mind that read rooms the way a general reads terrain, a weapon he had spent 26 years teaching to hate him. That was not a moral failing. For Tywin Lannister, it was something considerably worse. It was a waste. And the dead. He did not linger on the dead. He noted them the way a general notes whether, a condition to be accounted for, a variable to be incorporated into the revised plan. They were not a ghost story. They were not a theological question. They were a logistics problem of existential scale, and Tywin Lannister had never encountered a logistics problem he could not solve if he was given sufficient time, sufficient gold, and the freedom to make decisions without explaining them to men who would not understand. The Red Wedding was a game of chess being played on a ship that was already sinking. He reached for the Frey letter. He held it over the candle and watched it burn. He held it until the flame reached his fingers. He set the ash in the grate. He looked at the Bolton letter, sealed, ready, 4 sentences of precise and terrible instruction, and placed it in the grate without ceremony. It did not deserve ceremony. He took a fresh sheet of parchment. He trimmed a new quill with 3 careful strokes of his knife. He began to write, slowly, because what he wrote next would outlast every letter he had ever written. All the debts called in. All the wars won. All the careful and terrible architecture of 40 years of consequence. If he did this correctly, it would be the only letter that mattered. Outside, King's Landing moved through its dark hours, oblivious and alive. One window in the Tower of the Hand burned above it all. One man at a desk, the ash cooling beside him. His maester arrived at dawn to find the candles burned to nothing and the hand of the king already dressed. Tywin did not look up from his desk when the door opened. He held up one hand, not a wave, not a dismissal, a precise gesture that communicated exactly one thing: leave before you are asked to leave. The maester, who had served 3 hands before Tywin, and had learned within his first week that imprecision was its own form of injury in this office, left without speaking. The door closed without sound. Tywin read through what he had written in the night. He read it the way he read everything, not for feeling, not for satisfaction, but for error. A single phrase that could be misread. A single commitment that exceeded what he intended to offer. He found none. He set the parchment down, picked up his knife, and trimmed a fresh quill. Then, he began to write the letter that would travel north. It took him 40 minutes. He wrote it 4 times. The first 3 he burned, not because they were wrong in their facts, but because the weight of each sentence was not yet calibrated correctly. 1 word of warmth and a 17-year-old king with a dead father, and 3 years of hatred behind him, would read it as weakness. 1 word too cold, and he would read it as a trap. Which it was, in the way that all useful propositions are traps, but it needed to feel, to a sharp and angry young man reading it in whatever God-forsaken Frey bedchamber he had been given, like the 1 letter in 3 years of war that was telling him something true. The 4th draft was correct. He read it once more. What I write to you now is not peace, it is a proposition. House Lannister and House Stark have been destroying each other for 3 years, over a quarrel that serves neither of us, and exhausts both. I have received intelligence, the nature of which I will share with you in person, at a meeting of your choosing, that requires the full and undivided military capacity of the 7 kingdoms before the year is out. I am prepared to offer the following, as evidence of good faith, rather than weakness: the return of Sansa Stark to your custody, the annulment of her marriage to my son, and a public acknowledgment that the execution of Lord Eddard Stark was conducted without my sanction or approval. In return, I ask only that you meet with me at the Ruby Ford within a fortnight, with a guard of 50 men or fewer, and that you hear what I have to say before you decide. Burn this letter if you wish. Send no reply. Simply arrive, or don't. I will wait 3 days. T.L. He set it aside. He asked for Tyrion. Tyrion Lannister arrived in his father's solar carrying a cup of wine he had not yet drunk, wearing the expression he always wore when summoned without explanation. The face of a man who has learned, through long practice, that preparation and anticipation are not the same thing, and that in his father's presence, neither is particularly useful. He looked at the desk. He looked at his father. He noted that Tywin's eyes carried the particular quality of a man who has not slept, but has not wasted the hours. He had seen that quality in siege commanders, in the best ones, the ones who used the night before a battle to revise rather than to dread. He said nothing. He waited. "Sit down," Tywin said. Tyrion sat. He raised his cup and then, because his father was still watching him with an expression that was not quite the expression he kept in normal inventory, he lowered it again without drinking. "I have been miscalculating you," Tywin said. The cup in Tyrion's hand did not move. This was notable because Tyrion's hands were almost never still. He said nothing. He waited with the careful patience of a man who has been burned by hope before, and has learned to treat unexpected warmth the way a soldier treats unexpected quiet, as the thing that precedes the thing rather than the thing itself. Tywin did not repeat himself. He did not clarify or soften or look away. He picked up the letter to Robb Stark and set it to one side, and then he folded his hands on the desk in the way he folded them when he was about to give operational instructions, which was the only gesture Tyrion had ever learned to read in him with any confidence. "The political situation has changed," Tywin said. "The Red Wedding will not occur." Tyrion absorbed this without expression. Then he said, "Walder Frey is going to be very upset." "Walder Frey," Tywin said, "is going to comply." "And the Northern campaign is being revised." Tywin looked at him. Not through him, which was the usual direction. At him. "I require a mind capable of managing complexity without falling in love with its own cleverness. I have been sending that mind to count debts and attend council meetings where the most useful contribution available to him was deciding which direction to face." Tyrion was very still. You will be given 3 tasks, Tywin continued. The first, supervise the annulment of your marriage to Sansa Stark. The grounds are non-consummation. The petition goes to the High Septon. And you will cooperate fully and without complaint or commentary. I never wanted the marriage. Then this requires no courage from you. The second task, compile everything the Night's Watch has sent to King's Landing in the last 2 years. Every raven, every report, every letter that arrived was noted by a maester and was subsequently ignored. I want a summary. Dates, numbers, locations, written in language that a lord who has never been north of the neck can understand. He paused. You will not editorialize. Tyrion's expression shifted by a fraction. And the third. Find Samwell Tarly and bring him quietly to the capital. He is a Night's Watch brother currently traveling south from beyond the wall. He is a Tarly by birth, which means he can be found by writing to Horn Hill. Tell them the hand of the king requires his testimony on a matter of crown importance. Do not tell them what matter. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. He looked at his cup, and then at his father, and then at the desk between them. Why? Tywin considered this. Not the question itself, he had anticipated the question, but the precise amount of information that answering it required. He said, because every war I have planned to fight for the next 10 years has been made irrelevant by something considerably larger, and you are the only person in this family who reads fast enough to be useful. Tyrion stood. He moved toward the door. He was at the threshold, one hand on the frame, when Tywin added, without looking up from the letter he had already lifted, take the wine. You will need to think clearly on an empty stomach. Tyrion stopped. He did not turn around. After a moment that lasted the length of approximately 26 years, he took the wine and went. The ravens left that afternoon. 3 of them. Tywin's own clerk prepared the messages under the hand's direct supervision, which was unusual enough that the young man's handwriting deteriorated visibly from the first line to the third. He was told to trim a new quill and start again. He did. The first raven carried a single sentence to Walder Frey at the twins, sealed with Tywin's personal sigil, harm a hair on a Stark head, and I will ensure that the name Frey is remembered only in the same breath as the word rubble. The second raven carried a private message to wherever Roose Bolton was on the road north, addressed by name, sealed separately. The wax pressed with Tywin's ring rather than the hand's stamp, the arrangement has been cancelled. You will come to King's Landing alone. Bring nothing. Tell no one. I will explain the rest when you arrive. T.L. The third raven carried a letter to the maester at Castle Black, not a command, not a request, simply a list of questions, each one numbered, each one specific. Requesting written responses within 7 days. How many whites were raised at the massacre at the Fist of the First Men? What physical evidence of the others exists, and in whose possession? Whether Sam Tarly's report of the Obsidian kill had been corroborated by other witnesses. What the current garrison count was at each occupied castle along the wall. The clerk noted afterward, to no one in particular, that the hand seemed unusually well rested for a man who appeared to have been working since before midnight. No one responded to this observation. It did not seem like the kind of observation that invited response. The ravens went north. The letter to Robb Stark went with a fast courier, relay horses, with instructions to ride through the night. 700 miles of road between a piece of parchment and a 17-year-old king who had every reason in the world to burn it unread. Tywin calculated the odds that Robb Stark would burn it without reading it. He concluded they were low. Robb Stark was Ned Stark's son. Ned Stark had never once, in 40 years of acquaintance, failed to read what was put in front of him. He picked up his next piece of correspondence. He had a kingdom to run, and the morning was already wasting. The letter arrived between the second and third courses. His maester brought it to the Solar on a tray, which was unnecessary. It was a single piece of folded parchment, not a platter, but the maester was nervous, and nervous men create ceremony where none is required. Walder Frey took it without looking at him. He waited until the door was closed. Then he broke the seal. He had seen Tywin Lannister's personal sigil 4 times in his life. Each time it had arrived attached to something that rearranged the furniture of the world he was living in. He had learned, by the second time, to read these letters while seated. He read it once. Then, again, then a third time, not because the language was ambiguous, it was the least ambiguous thing he had ever read, but because some part of him, old and stubborn and furious, needed the repetition to accept what it said. Harm a hair on a Stark head, and I will ensure that the name Frey is remembered only in the same breath as the word rubble. No salutation, no pleasantry, no acknowledgement of the arrangement that had been in place for 3 months, of the Lannister gold already promised, of the years of planning already embedded in the seating arrangements for the feast happening beneath his feet at this precise moment. No acknowledgement, either, of the fact that Walder Frey had committed himself, had committed his house, his sons, his grandsons, his reputation, to a night's work that could not be half done. You did not invite a wolf into your hall and then decide to let it leave. He sat with the letter in his lap for the length of time it took a servant to knock, enter, ask if he required anything, and leave again without receiving an answer. Then he burned it. He went downstairs. He sat at the head of his long table. He watched his servants carry in the roasted meats and the bread and the flagons of wine, watched his musicians pick up their instruments, watched his daughters and granddaughters take their seats, watched Rosalind Frey, married to Edmure Tully not 2 hours ago, still wearing the expression of a girl who had dressed herself for an execution and arrived to find a wedding, watched Rosalind gradually, across the first course and into the second, allow her shoulders to drop from where they had been, pressed up near her ears, with the specific tension of someone braced for a blow that was not arriving. Walder Frey had survived 5 wars and 5 wives by doing one thing exceptionally well. He read which way the wind was blowing. He had been doing it since he was a boy, watching his father miscalculate alliances. He had done it at the Trident, arriving late enough that the losing side could not claim him, and early enough that the winning side could not ignore him. 90 years of it, and the wind tonight was blowing from King's Landing, and it was cold, and it said one thing only: stand down. Across the table, Robb Stark was laughing at something his wife had said. That foreign girl. The one he had married instead of a Frey. The one who had cost Walder Frey a queen's alliance, who had made him a footnote to a broken oath, who sat there now in Walder's own hall eating Walder's own food, looking alive in a way she had no right to be. Walder Frey drank his wine. He held the cup slightly too tightly. His knuckles, old and knobbed and mapped with veins, went pale against the metal stem. No one at his table was looking at his hands. No one at his table was looking at anything except the feast he had provided. He watched Robb Stark laugh, and he drank his wine, and he did not signal to anyone, and the evening proceeded as a wedding. The letter was handed to him by a courier who appeared at his elbow between the soup and the roasted duck. The courier said nothing. He knew better. He placed it in Bolton's palm and withdrew before Bolton had unfolded it. Bolton read it in his lap. He was good at this, reading without appearing to read, processing without appearing to process. He had spent 20 years cultivating the particular stillness that made men underestimate how much was moving beneath the surface. His face, people said, never changed. They were right. It was his most useful quality and his most deliberate one. He read the letter. He folded it again. He put it in his sleeve. Then he picked up his fork and finished his duck. The hall was loud around him. Frey's laughing too hard, the way people laugh when they are nervous and trying not to look it. Musicians playing something that wanted to be festive and kept collapsing into something merely loud. Robb Stark, 12 feet away, eating with the comfortable appetite of a man who believed himself among allies. Bolton ate his duck and looked at the table and did his arithmetic. He could kill Robb Stark right now. Not cleanly, not with the precision the original arrangement had planned for, but it could be done. The knife at his belt was adequate. The distance was manageable. 3 of his own men were in the hall. In the first moments of confusion, he could reach the door. He had always had a plan for leaving a room quickly. It was the kind of plan a man made when he spent his life in rooms where the weather could change. He thought about this for approximately the time it took to finish the duck. Then he set down his fork. Not because of the threat in Tywin Lannister's letter. Tywin's threats were real, but threats were simply calculations, and every calculation could be revised with sufficient information. What stopped him was the last 4 words. I will explain the rest. That phrase sat in the part of his mind that was never quiet, the part that catalogued what other men knew and what they didn't, and it asked a question he could not answer. What had changed? 3 days ago, the Red Wedding had been Tywin Lannister's plan, his architecture, his arrangement. The gold that was going to arrive at the Dreadfort in exchange for this night's work already had a room prepared for it. And then, between 3 days ago and tonight, something had happened inside the Tower of the Hand that was significant enough to make Tywin Lannister dismantle 3 months of preparation and send a raven north with the specific brevity of a man who has already moved on to the next problem. Roose Bolton did not know what that something was. This bothered him more than the cancelled arrangement. More than the gold he would not receive tonight. More than Robb Stark eating his food and laughing 12 feet away. He was a man who organized his life around the principle that information was the only currency that did not devalue, and somewhere in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister had just acquired a quantity of it that Roose Bolton did not possess. He drank his wine. He did not look at Robb Stark. He watched Walder Frey hold his cup too tightly at the head of the table, and thought that Frey's fury, at least, was legible. His own face did not change. He began composing, in the part of his mind reserved for composition, the precise route he would take to King's Landing. He noticed something was wrong from the third course. He could not have named what he noticed. He had spent 3 years at war, and the instinct that had kept him alive, the one that operated below the level of thought, below the level of language, in the same territory as Grey Wind's awareness of a room, told him that this hall felt off in a way he could not account for. No one had been rude to him. No one had insulted Talisa. The Freys were exactly as unwelcoming as they always were, which was to say deeply and constitutionally unwelcoming in a way that had stopped reading as a threat and started reading as weather. It was an absence, a specific quality of readiness he had felt in the hours before every battle he had ever fought, a tightening in the air of a room that had a plan in it. That tightening simply was not there tonight. The hall felt like a hall, just a hall. Men eating and drinking at a wedding without a single one of them positioned near a door. The raven arrived between the last of the roasted boar and the first of the honeyed wine. A servant brought it to him, a small, folded thing with a seal he recognized before he broke it. He excused himself. He walked out of the twins and onto the bridge, above the green fork, into the cold and the dark, and he broke the seal and read the letter by torchlight with the river moving black and indifferent beneath him. He read it again, slower, then a third time, standing very still on a bridge in the riverlands, with the torchlight moving in the wind and the water below, carrying whatever it was carrying south toward the sea. I will wait 3 days. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Greatjon Umber camped on the far side of the bridge and watching the Lord of Winterfell stand alone above a river in the dark, began visibly wrestling with the question of whether to go out there, and visibly losing the wrestling match in favor of staying where he was told. Robb looked north, not at anything specific, just north, the way his father had always looked north, toward the dark, toward whatever was up there that his father had believed was worth spending a life standing between it and the rest of the world. He went back inside. He sat beside Talisa. He drank his wine. He told her nothing. He watched Walder Frey at the head of the table drinking steadily with his knuckles pale around his cup, watched Roose Bolton eating with the specific stillness of a man who had just made a private decision, watched the musicians play something that was supposed to be celebratory. Later, in the room they had been given, with the wedding noise dying room by room below them, Talisa asked him whether everything was all right. She asked in the quiet voice she used when she already suspected the answer, and was asking anyway because she believed he should be permitted to say it aloud. He looked at the letter on the table between them. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think it might be." The rubies were still there. 17 years in the riverbed and the current had not carried them all away. They caught the morning light in the shallows, small, dark red, easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for. Robb Stark knew what he was looking for. Every child in the Seven Kingdoms knew what had happened at this ford. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had died here with Robert Baratheon's warhammer in his chest and his rubies scattering across the water, and everything that followed, the dynasty that fell, the dynasty that rose, the war that Robb was currently losing, could be traced in a straight line from this shallow crossing to this particular morning. Tywin Lannister was already there when Robb's host appeared on the ridge. 300 riders, spread in a loose arc on the southern bank. Not a formation, not a threat. 300 men arranged with the specific deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about what 300 looked like from a distance and had concluded that it looked like exactly what he wanted it to look like. Among them, no banners, no trumpets, no announcement of any kind. Tywin himself sat on a camp stool at the water's edge, eating a cold meal from a field kit, reading a folded document. He did not look up when Robb's scouts appeared on the ridge. He did not look up when Robb descended to the ford with his guard. He looked up when Robb's horse stopped 6 feet from his camp stool. And then he closed the document, set it on the table beside his meal, and looked at the king in the north with the expression of a man assessing weather. He did not stand. Robb did not ask him to. He had brought 62 men. He had been told 50. He had genuinely intended 50 until Great John Umber had explained, with the particular clarity of a very large man who has decided something, that he was coming. Robb had told him to stay at a distance. The Great John had interpreted this as a personal challenge against his physical capabilities, and then interpreted the instruction itself as optional. He sat now on his horse at 100 yards, arms folded, watching the meeting with an expression that suggested he was calculating how long it would take him to reach the riverbank if something went wrong. His arithmetic was probably correct. Lord Stark, Tywin said. The title was deliberate. Not your grace, not the recognition Robb's kingship required, not the insult of its denial either, but something exact and careful that occupied the precise space between the two. Lord Lannister, Robb said. Tywin looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Your father was an honorable man. He was killed on the order of a boy I could not fully control. I hold myself responsible for the events that resulted from that failure of management. He paused, not for effect, simply because the next sentence needed its own space. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you to consider that I understand what it cost you. The blackfish, riding at Robb's left shoulder, made a sound that was not quite a word. Robb stilled him with one hand without looking away from Tywin. It was the blackfish who spoke. This was deliberate also. Northerners negotiated through ceremony when facing a man they distrusted, through a voice that was not the king's voice, so that the king's voice remained uncompromised until the moment it was needed. Acknowledgement and accountability are different things, the blackfish said. His tone was the tone of a man who has been told many things by many people and has long since stopped caring about the tone in which they were delivered. They are, Tywin agreed. Which is why I didn't begin with a speech. He reached into the leather satchel at his feet. He produced a sheaf of documents, perhaps 12 pages, tied together, the top page bearing the Night's Watch seal, and placed them on the folding table. Read those before you say anything else. Robb dismounted. He picked up the documents. He read. The blackfish read over his shoulder, and Robb could feel the older man's breathing change. Not much, barely perceptible, but the blackfish's breathing was the most controlled thing about him, and any change in it was information. The first pages were the Night's Watch Raven reports, a list of names, ranging brothers lost at the Fist of the First Men, 211 of them, dates, locations, the specific notation, in a maester's careful hand, that the losses were attributable not to wildling attack, but to something that the surviving rangers described in terms that the maester had clearly struggled to record without editorializing. Blue eyes. Rising, walking south. The second document was Samwell Tarly's written account of the Obsidian Kill. It was not the account of a man constructing a story. It was too specific in the wrong places for that, too specific about what he had felt and smelled and failed to do in the moments before and after, the kind of specificity that only lived in genuine memory. The third document was a census of the wall's 19 castles. 17 of them were listed as unstaffed. 2 were listed as operational. Against these numbers, a garrison count, 912 men, current total. Robb set the pages down. The Night's Watch has been telling this to King's Landing for years, he said. Nobody listened. No, Tywin agreed. They didn't. He let this sit without explanation, without excuse, because explaining it would require him to say something that sounded like guilt. And instead he moved forward. The Night's Watch has 900 men. The Wall has 19 castles, 17 of which are staffed by no one. 900 men are not an army, they are a gesture. He stood now, not quickly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been sitting on a camp stool for 2 hours and was not going to perform athleticism for an audience. What stands between the dead and the living is a 600-foot wall of ice. Ice melts. The Blackfish said nothing. This was its own form of response. I have 40,000 men I can put in the field within a month, Tywin continued. The Tyrells have another 80,000 available from the Reach. I have gold enough to purchase 10,000 Cersei sellswords if the campaign requires them. And I have Dragonstone's obsidian, which will now be fashioned into weapons rather than decorative flooring. He looked at Robb with the directness of a man who had long ago decided that his time was worth too much to be spent on indirection. What I do not have is time. Neither do you. Robb looked north across the ford, the way he had looked north from the bridge at the Twins 3 nights ago. A habit, maybe, or a direction. What do you want in exchange? What I am prepared to offer first, Tywin said, so that the question of what I want does not color what you hear. He sat again. He picked up his document and set it down. Sansa Stark is returned to your custody. Her marriage to my son is already in the process of annulment, non-consummation, petition to the High Septon, completed within the month. Second, a formal and public acknowledgement that the execution of Lord Eddard Stark was conducted without small council sanction and in violation of the terms brokered before the throne. He paused. On record. In writing. With the hand seal. The Blackfish looked at Robb. Robb did not look back. What you want, Robb said. Your forces as the northern vanguard when the time comes. The North's knowledge of the terrain beyond the wall. 1 year of peace while the mobilization is arranged. He looked at Robb steadily. And your recognition that the Iron Throne's authority over the 6 kingdoms remains intact. I am not dissolving your kingship. A resentful vassal is a liability I cannot afford. But I need your armies functional and your supply lines open, and I need them oriented north rather than south. The river moved between them. Somewhere behind Robb, one of his horses shifted its weight and stamped against the cold. The men responsible for my father's death, Robb said. I want them to answer for it. Tywin looked at him for a moment. The expression did not change, but something behind it moved slightly, the way water moves beneath ice, present and invisible simultaneously. I will take it under advisement, he said. He did not explain what he had already decided. That was not Robb Stark's business. Not yet. They did not sign anything. They did not embrace or swear oaths or perform any of the rituals that men use to convince themselves that agreements were binding. Tywin stood, folded his documents, placed them in his satchel with the same economy of movement he applied to everything, and said, I will send a maester within the week with the formal terms. You may have your advisors review them. He mounted his horse. He did not look back. Robb watched the 300 riders move south along the Trident until the tree line took them. The Blackfish came up beside him. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, that man is either the most dangerous ally in the world, or the most dangerous enemy, and I can't tell you which one he's decided to be. Robb watched the empty road. Neither can he, Robb said. I think. Not yet. They rode back toward camp. The rubies caught the light in the shallows behind them, dark red and patient, going nowhere. Petyr Baelish arrived back in King's Landing on a Tuesday. He had been recalled from the road to the Vale on the pretext of a financial emergency. The specific language of the summons was urgent irregularities in the Crown's debt ledgers requiring immediate review by the Master of Coin, and he arrived wearing traveling clothes and the expression of a man who had correctly identified the summons as a pretext and had spent 3 days on the road trying to determine whose pretext it was and what it was a pretext for. He had not arrived at the correct answer. Tywin had expected this. Petyr Baelish was extraordinarily intelligent in the way of men who have spent their entire lives in rooms they were not supposed to be in, reading people, reading debts, reading the distance between what was said and what was meant. His weakness was a mirror image of his strength. He was so accustomed to being the cleverest man available that he had never fully developed the instinct that told other men when to be afraid. Tywin had brought him not to the small council chamber and not to his solar. He had brought him to the lower cells of the Red Keep. Not the black cells, those were for men whose detention needed to be invisible, and Littlefinger's detention needed to be something slightly different. It needed to be legible. It needed to feel, from the first moment, like the room in which something had already been decided. 3 gold cloaks stood at the door. A single torch, a table with 2 chairs and 1 document. Littlefinger looked at the room. He looked at the gold cloaks. He looked at Tywin, who had been seated for some time, who gave every impression of a man who had arrived early, not because he was eager, but because he found the concept of being made to wait faintly offensive. Then Littlefinger smiled. "This seems excessive," he said, "for an accounting irregularity." "Sit down," Tywin said. Littlefinger sat. He crossed one leg over the other and settled into the chair with the ease of a man making himself comfortable in someone else's space, which was something he had been doing his entire life. He looked at the document on the table between them, but did not reach for it. "Whatever this is," he said, "I should tell you that I have been extraordinarily useful to the Crown for the last several years, and that men who are extraordinarily useful tend to have made certain arrangements that account for their—" Janos Slynt, Tywin said. Littlefinger stopped. "You bribed him," Tywin continued. "Specifically, you arranged and funded the betrayal of Lord Eddard Stark to the City Watch at the moment of his arrest in the throne room. The bribe was structured as 3 installments, the last of which was delivered the night before Lord Stark's imprisonment." He slid the document across the table. "Slynt wrote this in Harrenhal 4 weeks ago, when he was informed that a confession already existed and that his cooperation would be taken into account during sentencing. It is specific in the way that men are specific when they are not constructing a story, but remembering one." Littlefinger looked at the document. The smile was still there, but it had changed, thinned, pulled tight against something underneath it. He did not pick up the pages. He said, "You cannot prove this. I have proved it. I am showing you the proof as a courtesy, not as a request for your confirmation." Tywin folded his hands on the table. "You arranged the death of a man who was Hand of the King and Warden of the North. You did so in a manner that initiated a war that has cost the 7 Kingdoms 3 years, and a number of men I won't bother to specify, because you have never found numbers particularly interesting." He paused. "You also, at some earlier point, arranged the death of Jon Arryn, the previous Hand, by inducing his wife to poison him and write a letter to the North blaming the Lannisters. I do not yet have documentation for this. I will." Now the smile left entirely. "You know," Littlefinger said, and something in his voice had shifted, dropped closer to the thing beneath the performance, "that this seems like an extraordinarily expensive way to remove a competitor." "I don't have competitors," Tywin said. "I have instruments, and I have complications. You have been a very effective instrument. You are now a complication." The gold cloaks moved at Tywin's gesture. Littlefinger looked at them with the expression of a man revising his options in real time and finding the list shorter than it had ever been before. He said, very quietly, "What are you doing?" "Cleaning," Tywin said. He stood. "You will remain here while I determine the most useful application of your arrest. A public trial eliminates your ability to cause further damage, but creates questions I am not yet ready to answer publicly. Exile to the Free Cities is cleaner, but requires assurances of containment that I am still arranging." He moved toward the door. "In the meantime, you will be fed, you will be housed, and you will not be harmed. None of this is kindness. It is inventory management." He left Petr Baelish alone in a cell with 3 gold cloaks and the document and the particular silence of a man who had just discovered, for the first time in his life, that someone had been reading the room from a direction he had not considered. Cersei was already dressed when Tywin arrived. This was significant. She had been warned he was coming, and she had chosen armor, which was what fine clothes were to his daughter in the same way that precise language was armor to him. She stood at the window with her back to the door and her hands folded and did not turn around when he entered. "Sit down, Cersei. I prefer to stand." He sat. He let her stand. He had learned, over 32 years, that the performance of defiance was something Cersei needed to complete before she was capable of hearing anything, and that interrupting it only extended it. She turned around. Her face was composed in the manner of someone who had been composing it since before he knocked. "You've arrested Littlefinger," she said. "You've cancelled the Red Wedding. You've been sending ravens north that my maester didn't prepare." She paused. "What are you doing?" "I'm correcting errors," he said. "Several of them are mine. Several are yours." "Mine," the word arrived sharp and flat. "You have had 3 years to shape Joffrey into something that could be managed," Tywin said. "I gave you a court, a council, the full authority of the Queen Regent's position. What you produced is a boy who beheads the hand of the king in a public square for the entertainment of a crowd, and then wonders why his kingdom is at war. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. That is not a failure of resources. That is a failure of judgment. He is king," Cersei said. He makes his own decisions the way a fire makes its own decisions about which direction to burn. He does not decide. He reacts, and everything around him catches." He looked at her steadily. "I am dispatching you to Casterly Rock to oversee the preparations for the northern campaign." The room was very still. "You are removing me," she said. "I am giving you an appointment. You are removing me from my son, from my court, from King's Landing," Tywin said. "Yes, the servants have already begun preparing your things. You will leave within the week." Cersei moved away from the window. She crossed the room with the specific energy of a woman who had spent her life learning that fury needed to be aimed correctly or it dispersed uselessly. "I will tell Joffrey," she said. "I will tell him what you're doing. He is the king. He can countermand this." "Tell him whatever you like," Tywin said. "He is your king." He stood. He adjusted his gloves. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not cruelty and was not affection, and was perhaps the expression a man wore when he looked at a calculation he had gotten wrong for 30 years and was only now correcting. "He will be king," he said, "for as long as he is useful." She heard it. Not a threat. Tywin's threats arrived with heat. This was something colder. A taxonomy. A filing system with categories she had not previously known existed, and in which she had just heard a door close. She went to Casterly Rock. She screamed about it for the length of time it took to pack. Then she went. Olenna Tyrell arrived without announcement, which was her preference, and which the Hand's guards had learned to accommodate after the first 3 attempts at protocol had produced in the Lady of Highgarden an expression that suggested she found the concept of being made to wait faintly offensive. She sat across from Tywin without being invited. She poured herself wine from the carafe on his desk without asking. She studied him the way she studied everyone, with the thoroughness of a woman who had spent 70 years reading rooms and had long since stopped being surprised by what she found. "You're saving the House of Cards," she said, "by removing the cards that are bending." Tywin looked at her. "I'm burning the cards that are bending. The remainder will hold." She considered this with the particular quality of attention that meant she was deciding whether to disagree or simply file it. "See that they do," she said finally. "The Reach does not put 80,000 men on a road for a Lannister funeral." She drank her wine. She set the cup down with the precision of someone who had never in her life placed anything carelessly. "The boy. Tommen, is he manageable? He is 11 years old and frightened, and wants very badly to do the right thing," Tywin said. "That is the most manageable combination of qualities available in a king." Olenna looked at him for a long moment. "And Joffrey?" Tywin picked up his quill. The conversation, the gesture communicated, was approaching its conclusion. "Joffrey," he said, "is being handled." She left without further ceremony. In the corridor, she told her companion that the hand of the king was either saving the realm or ending it, and that at her age the distinction mattered less than whether the wine remained good. Upstairs, Tywin wrote the summons for Tommen's first lesson in governance. He did not write the order for Joffrey. Not yet. He put his quill down. He looked at the candle. He picked the quill up again. Some calculations required more time than others, not because the answer was unclear, because the answer, once acted upon, could not be revised. He was not yet finished revising everything else. The Night's Watch ravens had been filed under Northern Correspondence Miscellaneous. Tyrion found them in the third cabinet he searched, behind 2 years of unpaid grain invoices and a series of letters from a minor reach lord complaining about a boundary dispute that had apparently been ongoing since the reign of Aerys I. The ravens were bundled together with a piece of cord, 41 of them, each one bearing the Night's Watch seal. Each one opened and read and set aside, and presumably forgotten in the specific way that things were forgotten in King's Landing, not through ignorance, but through the active, practiced, deliberate choice to find something more immediately useful to worry about. He read them in order. It took 2 hours and most of a carafe of wine. By the end, he was not drunk, which was unusual. He had stopped drinking somewhere around the 14th raven and hadn't noticed until the carafe was empty. He sat with the last letter in his hand and looked at the window and thought about 900 men and 19 castles, and 17 of those castles with no one in them, stretched across the top of the world like a sentence with most of its words missing. He wrote his summary that night. He did not editorialize. He had been told not to editorialize and had discovered, somewhere in the process of reading the letters, that the material did not require it. The facts were sufficient. The facts were, in their way, the most frightening thing he had ever compiled, and he had spent 3 years watching Joffrey rule. He left the summary on his father's desk before dawn. Samwell Tarly was afraid of everything, which meant he had excellent instincts. He arrived at the Red Keep escorted by 2 Night's Watch brothers and his own terror, which was the most present thing in the room when Tyrion met him in the corridor outside the council chamber. He was large, soft, young, and sweating in a way that suggested the sweating had been occurring for some time and showed no sign of resolving. He held a satchel against his chest with both arms. He looked at Tyrion with the expression of a man who had spent his life being told by various people that he was worthless and had not yet found a framework for handling someone looking at him with straightforward administrative interest. "You're the Tarly boy," Tyrion said. "Samwell, yes, my lord." He paused. "I don't know how to address you. You're the Hand's son. You were acting hand. You're master of laws. The form of address is—" "Tyrion is adequate," Tyrion said. "Come inside." Tywin was already seated. Tyrion had expected this. What he had not expected was the quality of attention his father brought to Sam Tarly's entrance, not the performative patience Tywin deployed for people he found tedious, but the particular stillness of a man who needed something from the room and was calibrating how to extract it. Sam sat down. He placed his satchel on the table. He looked at Tywin and his sweating intensified briefly, and then, with a visible effort that Tyrion found unexpectedly moving, he simply accepted where he was and began. He described the fist of the first men. He described the darkness and the cold and the sound the whites made, which was not a sound exactly but an absence, the absence of breath, of shifting, of any of the small continuous noises that living bodies produced without knowing it. He described the retreat south, the road to Craster's Keep, the cold that was different from ordinary cold, thinner, directed, preceding something rather than simply existing. Then he described the White Walker with the precision of a man reporting to a maester, height, movement, the temperature that preceded it, the way the obsidian blade had gone into it and the way it had come apart afterward, not like a man died, not like flesh failed, but like something structural had been removed, like ice when the architecture of freezing is reversed. He described all of it without being asked to repeat himself. He did not embellish. He said, at one point, "I know how this sounds," and Tywin said, "Continue," and Sam continued. When he finished, the room was quiet. Tyrion looked at his father. His father was looking at his folded hands. Tyrion found Sam in the corridor afterward, being handed a substantial meal by a servant Tywin had instructed his steward to deploy. Sam was eating with the concentrated relief of a man who had been expecting something considerably worse than food. "He believed you," Tyrion said. Sam looked up. "Did he?" "He didn't ask you to repeat yourself," Tyrion said. "My father asks people to repeat themselves when they've said something he found insufficient the first time. He didn't ask you once." He looked down the corridor. Then he found his brother Jaime in the adjacent passage, standing with arms folded, watching, having drifted close enough to hear without being asked to attend. Tyrion walked to him. He tells Jaime, he's not lying. Men who lie to save themselves tend to be specific in their lies. He was specific about everything, including the parts that made him look cowardly. Jaime said nothing for a moment. His golden hand caught the torchlight, and if it's real, Jaime said finally, all of it. Then we have considerably larger problems than anything currently on the council agenda, Tyrion said. He walked away. He stopped. He turned back toward Sam. Eat the rest of it. You look like the journey was difficult. Sam looked at his plate. It was. Then eat, Tyrion said. You'll be answering more questions tomorrow. The first obsidian shipment arrived from Dragonstone in a sealed wagon under Gold Cloak escort. The Dragonstone garrison commander had received Tywin's requisition with the careful compliance of a man who had been left in a castle by Stannis Baratheon with minimal instruction and was not going to create additional complications by arguing with the hand of the king. The obsidian was there. It had always been there, enormous deposits of it in the caves beneath the castle. Black and raw and abundant in the way that things were abundant when no one had found a use for them yet. Within 3 weeks of Tywin's order, a mining operation was producing more dragonglass per day than the Night's Watch had accumulated in the previous decade. The first shipment armed 300 men. Within a month, it would arm 3,000. Within 3 months, the number Tyrion had written in his production estimate and shown his father without comment, and his father had read without expression, and then sent immediately to the Westerland's forge masters with a single instruction, this is now the priority. The training ground at Winterfell had been cleared of snow. Robb Stark stood at its eastern edge with 2 of Tywin's cavalry commanders, men who had ridden north with the maester carrying the formal treaty terms, and who had agreed, at Robb's request, to observe what the northern forces could do before they wrote their operational assessment for the hand. In the center of the ground, Grey Wind was moving. The direwolf worked the formations the way water worked stone, not by force, but by finding the path that was already there. Robb had placed 20 men in a loose defensive line and told them to hold it. Grey Wind had been through that line 4 times in the last 3 minutes. Not through the men, through the gaps, the instinctive openings that formed when a living thing that large moved with that much speed toward a point where 2 men were standing close together. Both men moved without deciding to. Grey Wind was already gone by the time they registered what had happened. Robb let the commanders watch for a while. Then he called Grey Wind back with a sound that was barely audible at 20 yards, and the wolf came and sat at his heel and looked at the cavalry commanders with the expression of an animal that understood exactly what it was being evaluated for and found the evaluation only moderately interesting. One of the commanders said to his colleague, quietly, that it was the strangest cavalry he had ever seen. His colleague looked at the northern men recalibrating their formation. He said that the North had been fighting with wolves for 8,000 years. The first commander considered this. Then, perhaps that's why the North is still here. Robb heard it. He did not respond. He looked at Grey Wind, and then at the tree line to the north, beyond the walls of Winterfell, beyond the King's Road and the Gift and the wall itself. Grey Wind was looking there too. The wolf had been restless for 3 days. Not afraid. Grey Wind did not do afraid in any way Robb recognized, but aware. Oriented, the way a hound oriented toward a sound a man could not yet hear. Tyrion arrived on the 4th day. He came not as Hand's son, not as master of laws, but as the man Tywin had sent to conduct the operational conversation that could not be conducted by letter, the one that required the specific kind of attention that only existed in the same room. Jon Snow was already there. He had come down from Castle Black at Robb's summons. Thin and watchful and wearing the black of the Night's Watch, with the particular quality of a man who had put the cloak on meaning it rather than accepting it as a sentence. He looked at Tyrion across the table with the expression of a man assessing something he had not yet decided about. Tyrion looked back with the expression of a man who had learned that underestimated people were generally more interesting than the people doing the underestimating. "You killed a White Walker," Tyrion said. "Sam killed it," Jon said. "I watched. Sam has also described what you did beyond the wall for the better part of a year." The watching was apparently eventful. He poured 2 cups of wine and pushed one toward Jon, who did not touch it. My father knows you exist. He knows your value as an intelligence asset. He will not say that in precisely those terms. He would say something crisper and less flattering, but the operational reality is that you have spent more time north of the Wall than anyone currently alive who is also willing to speak to a Lannister. Jon was quiet for a moment. What does he want from me? Your knowledge, Tyrion said. Terrain, movement, the free folk, where they are, whether they will fight. He drank. My father doesn't ask for trust. He asks for information and he pays for it with resources. Currently the resource is obsidian and it is arriving faster than anyone expected. He looked at Jon with the directness that was the one quality he had inherited from his father and was not ashamed of. He also knows something about you that I suspect you don't know I know. Jon went very still. I am not going to say it in this hall, Tyrion said. I am going to say that he considers it a weapon. And I am going to say that he has decided not to use it yet. He set down his cup, which means he believes there are better weapons available first. Given what I've seen of his current choices, I find that information worth having. Jon looked at him for a long time. Then, he said, You're nothing like your family. I'm exactly like my family, Tyrion said. That's why none of them know what to do with me. He picked up his cup. Now, tell me about the terrain north of the Wall. All of it. We'll start with the Fist of the First Men and work outward. Jon picked up his wine. He talked until midnight. Tyrion wrote everything down. He waited 4 weeks. This was not patience in the conventional sense. Tywin Lannister did not experience patience as an exercise in restraint, but as a strategic condition. A deliberate arrangement of time in which other elements were allowed to reach their correct positions before the decision was executed. In 4 weeks, 3 things reached their correct positions. The first, Robb Stark's representatives arrived in King's Landing. The Blackfish, an Umber, and a Maester, carrying a list of conditions annotated in a hand Tywin recognized as the Blackfish's own. Blunt, economical, suspicious of every clause, demanding specificity wherever the language of the draft terms had permitted ambiguity. Tywin revised 3 clauses. He left the rest as written. The Blackfish reviewed the revisions with the expression of a man who had expected to find a trap and had found, instead, that the other man had simply corrected the thing he'd flagged. This bothered the Blackfish more than the trap would have. The second, Tommen. Tyrion spent 4 weeks in a small council room with the boy who would be king, and what he found there surprised him in the specific way that things surprised Tyrion, not suddenly, but gradually, building toward a conclusion he had not set out to reach. Tommen was 11 years old and frightened and wanted, with an earnestness that no amount of Lannister upbringing had managed to extinguish, to do things correctly. He listened. He asked questions when he didn't understand. He said, once, that he didn't think Joffrey had been happy, which was the most politically astute and emotionally accurate thing anyone had said in the Red Keep in 3 years. And he said it with the guileless certainty of a child who had simply been paying attention. Tyrion told his father about it that evening. Tywin said nothing. He wrote something on the document in front of him that Tyrion could not read from where he stood. Then he said, "Continue the lessons." That was all. The third thing that reached its correct position in 4 weeks was Cersei's correspondence from Casterly Rock, which Tywin's agents intercepted, copied, and delivered to his desk each morning alongside his other correspondence. She was writing to Joffrey every 3 days. The letters were alternately furious and manipulative, oscillating between commands and performances of maternal suffering in the specific way of someone who had learned that both approaches worked on Joffrey and was deploying them in rotation. None of the letters were delivered. Joffrey believed his mother had stopped writing. What this did to him was legible in his behavior. A particular instability that his remaining attendants noted in their reports without understanding its cause. Tywin read the intercepted letters without expression. He filed them under Cersei, Casterly Rock, 299 AC. He did not respond to any of them. On the 28th day, he summoned the High Septon. The legal framework took 1 hour to explain and 3 days to document. The charge was specific, that Joffrey of Houses Baratheon and Lannister, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, did order the public execution of Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and Hand of the King, in the throne room of the Red Keep, without the sanction of the small council, without due process under the laws of the Seven Kingdoms, and in direct violation of the terms of Lord Stark's confession, and the arrangement brokered before the throne by Sansa Stark and the High Septon of King's Landing. The High Septon reviewed the charge. He looked at the documentation. He asked whether the Hand understood the constitutional precedent this would require. Tywin said that the Hand understood it completely, and had in fact written the constitutional argument himself, and that if the High Septon wished to review it, he was welcome to, but that it was 14 pages, and the Hand had other business this morning. The High Septon read all 14 pages. He found no errors. He placed his seal on the convening document with the expression of a man who had just realized that the machinery he served was being operated by someone who understood it better than he did, and was uncertain whether to find this reassuring or alarming. The tribunal was set for 3 days hence. 3 great lords, the Master of Laws, the High Septon. The charge was public. The record would be public. Tywin did not conceal what he was doing, because concealment would have undermined the entire purpose, which was not merely to remove Joffrey, but to do so in a manner that produced a legal record, something that said, in the language that civilizations used to tell themselves what they were, that what had been done to Eddard Stark had been wrong, and that the institution of the Seven Kingdoms had corrected it. He told no one else until the morning the gold cloaks went to Joffrey's chambers. The door opened while Joffrey was still asleep. He woke with the particular alarm of someone who had spent 3 years making enemies and had never quite managed to believe that the walls around him might not hold forever. He sat up. He saw the gold cloaks, 5 of them, in the chamber, which had never happened, which was wrong in a way that his mind registered before his eyes had finished adjusting to the torchlight. He screamed for Sir Meryn. Sir Meryn was not there. He screamed for his mother, and even as he did it something in him knew she was not there either, had not been there for a month. And the knowing and the screaming happened simultaneously in the way of a boy who understood things clearly and refused to accept them. He threatened the gold cloaks. He told them they were committing treason. He told them he was the king, the chosen of the gods, the blood of the dragon, this last phrase arriving with a vagueness that suggested he had heard it somewhere and found it impressive without understanding its implications. He said that his grandfather would hear about this and then, mid-sentence, stopped, because his grandfather was the reason the gold cloaks were in his room and he had just reached that understanding at the precise moment of saying it. He was 17 years old and he was afraid, and for the first time in 3 years there was nothing available to him that could convert the fear into something else. They brought him to the tribunal in his court clothes, which an attendant had quietly laid out, and which Joffrey had put on because even in the worst morning of his life, the instinct toward presentation did not fully leave him. The tribunal was not designed for spectacle. It was designed for record. The hall held perhaps 300 people, lords, maesters, members of the court, who had been present in the throne room on the day Eddard Stark died. Tywin had specifically invited those who had been present. He needed witnesses who were not performing memory, but confirming it. The charge was read aloud by the Master of Laws. Joffrey, seated before the tribunal, listened with the expression of a boy discovering that the word no had been extended to cover categories he had never previously considered. His defense came quickly, and with the conviction of someone who believed it completely, he was king, and kings could not be tried for the actions of their reign. The precedent was clear. The historical record supported it. He was not wrong about historical precedent. He had clearly rehearsed this point in the hours before the tribunal, which meant he had understood, from the moment the gold cloaks arrived, what was coming. Tywin let him finish. Then he stood. He did not address Joffrey. He addressed the room, the lords, the maesters, the 3 great lords on the tribunal bench, the High Septon, the record. A king who cannot be held accountable for murder, he said, is not a king. He is a tyrant. The difference between the two is not the crown. Both wear one. The difference is whether the law exists beneath them or whether the law simply ends where their will begins. He paused. The 7 kingdoms do not survive what is coming on the authority of a tyrant. They survive on the authority of an institution. This proceeding is the institution correcting itself. He sat. The tribunal deliberated for 40 minutes. This was primarily procedural. The facts were not in dispute, because the facts had happened in front of 300 people and had been fully documented in the court records. The deliberation was the legal mechanism doing its work, turning the judgment into something that could stand in parchment and be read in 100 years without ambiguity. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. Tywin was in his solar when it was carried out. He read reports. He answered correspondence. He signed 3 documents related to the northern mobilization and 1 related to a trade dispute in the Reach that had been waiting on his desk for 6 weeks. Outside the window, somewhere below, the yard of the Red Keep was very quiet for a few minutes, and then was not. His clerk brought him the confirmation an hour later. He read it. He placed it in the relevant file. He picked up his quill. He did not experience it as grief. He had known Joffrey for 17 years in the way that one knew a Fire One had been asked to manage, always present, always requiring attention, always capable of spreading. What he experienced was the closing of an account. A debt that had been accruing since the day in the throne room, settled now in the only currency that cleared it. He did not mark the moment with anything. Tommen cried at his own coronation, which was not unprecedented and which Tywin had anticipated. He was 11 years old, and his brother was dead, and he was being given the crown that had come from his brother's head, and he was. Underneath all of it, a boy who wanted very badly to do things correctly, and could see that doing things correctly in this situation was going to be very difficult for a very long time. The crown was placed on his head by the High Septon. It was slightly too large. Someone had failed to measure correctly. Tommen held his head very still so it would not slide. Tyrion watched from the side of the hall. He was named Master of Laws formally that morning, in a brief ceremony that involved a document and his father's seal, and nothing in the way of celebration. He accepted without joy, which was not the same as accepting without understanding. He understood exactly what his father had built. He understood the structure of it, the Littlefinger removal, the Cersei exile, the Northern Treaty, the tribunal, and now this, a boy king with no capacity for cruelty and every capacity for management. He understood that every piece had been placed by one man in 4 weeks, working backward from a conclusion that he had reached in a single night, for reasons he had not fully explained to anyone. That evening Tyrion found his father in the solar. Tywin was reading. He did not look up. Tyrion poured 2 cups of wine. He put one in front of his father. He said, "You could have done this 20 years ago." Tywin picked up the cup. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "No, I couldn't." He did not explain what he meant. He picked up his document. Tyrion took his wine and went to do the work that was, beginning today, properly his. The letter to Stannis Baratheon took 11 minutes to write and represented the most politically uncomfortable 11 minutes Tywin had spent since the whole business began. Not because the logic was difficult, the logic was clean. Stannis had perhaps 4,000 men, a fleet of questionable condition, and a claim to the Iron Throne that was technically sound and practically irrelevant, the kind of claim that was most useful as a lever and least useful as an actual throne. He also had, and this was the part that mattered, a genuine and documented commitment to fighting the dead that predated anyone else's by approximately 2 years. He had been north. He had seen what was coming. He had believed it when believing it required a man to accept that everything he understood about the world needed to be revised. Tywin respected this in the abstract way he respected all accurate assessments of difficult reality, which was to say, he found it strategically valuable and moved on. The uncomfortable part was the sentence that offered Stannis formal pardon. Writing a pardon for a man who had declared himself king required acknowledging that the declaring had occurred, and acknowledging it in writing meant creating a document that said, in the precise language of legal record, that the Iron Throne had considered Stannis Baratheon's claim legitimate enough to require formal extinguishing rather than simply ignoring. He wrote it anyway. He wrote it in 11 minutes. He sealed it and sent it north. Stannis replied in 9 days, which was faster than the travel time should have allowed, which meant he had been positioned closer to the wall than his last reported location. He accepted the pardon. He accepted the operational command of the Western Wall approach. He relinquished his claim to the Iron Throne before 3 witnesses, in writing, under his own seal. The last line of his acceptance letter said, "The throne can wait, the dead cannot." You understand this, which is the first sensible thing I have heard from King's Landing in 20 years. S.B. Tywin filed it. He did not respond to the last line. Some acknowledgments were best received in silence. The grain conversation with House Tyrell took 3 meetings and 1 dinner. Mace Tyrell required the 3 meetings. He was not a stupid man, but he was a cautious one, and caution in a man of his particular type expressed itself as a need to hear the same thing multiple times before accepting that it was real. By the 3rd meeting he had satisfied himself that Tywin was not constructing an elaborate trap to seize Reach grain stores for Lannister purposes, and he agreed in principle to the storage treaty. Olenna Tyrell required the dinner. She arrived at Highgarden's great hall, wearing the expression of a woman who had eaten at better tables and was prepared to be adequately fed rather than impressed. She ate. She listened to Mace outline the agreement. She said at the end of it, "We're feeding the 7 kingdoms for 2 winters on the promise that our titles survive whatever comes down from the north." She looked at Tywin. "That's an extraordinary amount of food to stake on a Lannister's word. The alternative," Tywin said, "is to feed no one." She considered this. Triple the acreage dedicated to winter wheat. Double the root vegetable stores. And I want a Tyrell seat on the small council that is not contingent on Margaery's marriage to the king. She paused. A permanent seat. Written into the charter. Tywin looked at her for a moment. "Done," he said. She picked up her fork. Then, the Reach feeds the realm. She ate a piece of roasted duck. See that the realm is worth feeding. Within 6 weeks, Highgarden and 11 satellite castles had redirected 30% of annual grain production to sealed long-term storage. Gold cloaks guarded the stores. Tyrion had written the rationing framework for King's Landing and the 6 largest southern cities, a system that was not draconian, but was systematic enough that a 2-year winter produced managed scarcity rather than riots. He had delivered the framework to Tywin's desk in 1 night, 16 pages, every edge case addressed. With a note at the bottom that said simply, "I find I write better policy when it matters." Tywin read it without comment. He sent it to the Master of Laws for implementation. Then he wrote, at the bottom of the note, a single word and sent it back. The word was, "Good." Tyrion read it standing in the corridor. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket and went back to work. The steel problem was simpler than the food problem, which was not the same as simple. Westerland's mines produced significant iron, and significant iron under Lannister direction meant the Westerland's forge district could be retooled faster than any comparable operation in the 7 kingdoms. The retooling required shutting down the production lines for decorative armor, ornamental swordwork, and the various luxury metalwork that Lannister gold had always subsidized as a demonstration of its own excess. Tywin shut them down in a single directive, which produced immediate complaints from the craftsmen whose specialty work was being suspended. Which produced in Tywin the expression of a man being told that his house was on fire and someone was concerned about the curtains. The forge district was redirected to arrowheads, spear tips, shield rims, the functional, unglamorous infrastructure of an army that would need to kill things that could not be killed by conventional means, and would therefore need to fire more arrows than anything in the history of the 7 kingdoms to compensate for the percentage of those arrows that would do nothing at all. The dragonglass supplemented this. Not replaced, there was not enough obsidian in the world to equip 40,000 men, but supplemented, for the units that would be fighting in direct contact with the dead rather than from the archer lines. 300 obsidian-tipped spears per shipment from Dragonstone, arriving every 12 days, distributed to the northern vanguard units by a logistics chain that Tyrion had designed and that worked with a reliability that his father had noted once, to a clerk, was better than anything the Westerland Supply Corps had managed at Blackwater. The clerk had written this down. Tyrion had been told about it 3 days later, by a different clerk, in the way that information traveled in the Red Keep, sideways, quietly, through channels that were not the intended ones. Heartsbane arrived on a gray morning in a wool-wrapped package with a Hornhill seal. Sam had written to his family. The letter had been careful. Careful in the specific way of a man who loved his family imperfectly and was asking them for the most important thing a Tarly could be asked for, knowing his father would refuse and framing the request so that his father's refusal would cost more than compliance. He had not written it alone. Tyrion had sat beside him for 2 hours, suggesting nothing, and listening carefully and occasionally noting, in the casual tone of a man commenting on weather, that a particular phrasing might produce a different result than Sam intended. The sword arrived. Randall Tarly's letter accompanying it said nothing. No salutation. No comment. Simply the sword, wrapped, sealed, delivered. The absence of language was its own language, and Sam read it standing in the corridor, with the package in his arms and his face doing something complicated. "He sent it," Sam said. "He sent it," Tyrion agreed. "Your father is a difficult man and a practical one, and you gave him a reason where before he had only a principle." He looked at the package. The sword will kill White Walkers. His pride in refusing it would not. Sam was quiet for a moment. "He's still going to hate me for this." "Probably," Tyrion said. "But he'll be alive to do it." Longclaw was already at Castle Black. Jon Snow had carried it back north after their conversation in Winterfell's Great Hall, along with Tyrion's operational notes, and a sealed letter from Tywin addressed to the Castle Black command that outlined, in the hand's characteristic shorthand, the full scope of what was being mobilized south of the wall and what would be required of the Night's Watch when it arrived. The response from Castle Black arrived within 5 days, sent by whoever was keeping order there in the absence of a Lord Commander. Tywin had read the footnote explaining that Lord Commander Mormont had been killed in a mutiny north of the wall some weeks prior, had noted it under operational losses, and had moved on. The message itself was 4 words. Unsigned beyond the Night's Watch seal, "We have been ready." Tywin had read those 4 words and returned to his correspondence. The Watch had been ready. The question that mattered now was whether the rest of the realm would be. Tyrion found his father at the desk at the end of it, the end of the grain treaties and the steel directives, and the Stannis negotiation, and the Valyrian steel inventory, and the 16 other things that had been managed in the last 8 weeks, each one a thread in something that was beginning, for the first time, to look like a whole cloth. He sat across from him without being invited. He poured wine without asking. He set a cup in front of his father, who did not touch it. 38,000 men under arms, Tyrion said. Food storage sufficient for 2 years across the populated south. Obsidian production at Dragonstone running ahead of estimate. 3 Valyrian steel blades allocated to the northern vanguard, with 2 more in negotiation. Stannis positioned at the wall's western flank. He drank. The Night's Watch garrison supplemented by 800 Tyrell men, which is the first time in the history of the institution that it has received voluntary reinforcement from the Reach. Tywin was reading something. He did not look up. "It's working," Tyrion said. He said it quietly, not with triumph, because triumph would have required him to feel that the situation deserved it, and instead, what he felt was something closer to the sensation of watching a very large and very dangerous thing that was almost, not yet but almost, under control. "You built this in 8 weeks." Tywin set down his document. He looked at the window. Outside, King's Landing was moving through its night, and somewhere past it the road went north, and somewhere past the road was the wall, and somewhere past the wall was the thing that was coming. 8 weeks, he said, and 40 years. He picked up the document again. The 40 years are why the 8 weeks were possible. Remember that. Tyrion looked at his cup. He thought about 40 years of a man building something so completely that when the real emergency arrived, the infrastructure was already there waiting to be redirected. He thought about the waste of it, all the years that Engine had spent moving in the wrong direction. He did not say this aloud. He finished his wine. He stood. "Get some sleep," he said, which was the closest he had come in 47 days to telling his father anything personal. Tywin did not respond. He was already reading again. The candle burned. The city breathed below. The ravens went north in the dark, carrying the weight of everything that had been built toward the thing that was coming. The cold arrived 3 days before the dead did. Not winter cold. The north had been cold for months, a manageable cold that men could work in and sleep through and push against. This was something different. It arrived from the north without wind, which was wrong, because cold without wind meant the cold itself was moving, was directed, was the advanced condition of something that understood what cold was for. The ravens stopped flying on the second day. The horses in the eastern stables spent the night pressed together in the center of their enclosure, refusing the walls. Tywin noted all of this in his field journal without commentary. He had been at the wall for 6 days, having ridden north 2 weeks ahead of the main force to see the terrain himself. Not because he distrusted the reports, but because a man who commanded from maps alone commanded a fiction rather than a field. He was 57 years old, and the ride had cost him something in his lower back that he had chosen not to acknowledge. He rode in silence, and ate in silence, and spent his evenings with the maps and his mornings on the wall's top, watching the north. On the third morning, the tree line moved. Robb Stark heard it before he saw it. A sound that was not a sound exactly, but an absence, the specific quality of silence that Grey Wind had been warning him about for 3 days, made suddenly total, as if every living thing within a mile had collectively decided to stop making noise at precisely the same moment. Then the dead came out of the trees. They came without formation, which was its own kind of formation, a mass, a surge, the specific chaos of things that did not require order, because order was a tool for preserving life, and they had no life to preserve. Whites, thousands of them, moving with the particular wrongness that no report had fully captured, and that Robb now understood could not be captured in language, because language was built by living people to describe living motion, and this was neither. He did not freeze. He had 3 years of war behind him, and 6 months of preparation, and Grey Wind at his left shoulder. And all 3 of these things told him the same thing simultaneously. Move. Vanguard. Advance, he said. Not a shout. A command, which was different, which carried differently. Beside him, Jon Snow repeated it in the language of the free folk, and the wildling line, 3,000 of them, Tormund Giantsbane at their center, obsidian-tipped spears and axes catching the gray morning light, moved forward with the specific quality of people who had been fighting the dead their entire lives and had been waiting a long time for a moment when they had something that actually worked against them. Grey Wind went first. The direwolf moved through the white formations the way he moved through everything, finding the gap before it existed, targeting the structural point. The place where 2 whites were positioned such that removing one destabilized the other. He did not fight them individually. He broke formation lines. He was fast enough that he was already gone before the whites in the disrupted section could reorient, and the obsidian-armed wildlings behind him hit those sections while they were still recalibrating. Robb fought in the middle of it. The dragonglass short sword in his left hand, his standard steel in his right. The dragonglass did what Sam had described. It went in, and the white came apart with a crack like frozen wood splitting, not like flesh, like architecture failing. The standard steel was for positioning, pushing, creating space, buying the half-second he needed to bring the dragonglass to bear correctly. He took a cut across the forearm in the first 20 minutes, not from a blade, from a hand, from fingers that were frozen hard enough to cut. He felt it as a line of cold rather than pain. He kept moving. The trenches caught at Stannis' signal, which arrived not as a horn but as his own voice, precise, loud, with the characteristic quality of a man who had never needed to perform authority because he had simply always had it. The oil-filled trenches ran 200 yards along the approach corridor, and they went up in a wall of orange that should have stopped the surge. It channeled it instead, which was what Tywin had calculated it would do, which was why the trench line was positioned not to block but to redirect, to funnel the dead into 2 specific corridors where the catapults on the wall above had been ranged and aimed during the preceding 3 days. Stannis' men held the fire line with the grim competence of soldiers who had been told exactly what to expect and had believed it and had prepared for it, and were now discovering that preparation and reality were 2 different textures of the same thing. 2 of his commanders lost men in the first hour. The whites that came through fire continued coming. They were slower, damaged, but they did not stop. Stannis himself killed 7 with a dragonglass blade before his horse went down beneath him. He stood in the ash and the smoke and found another horse and continued. His face carried the expression it always carried, the expression of a man who believed that the appropriate response to difficulty was to continue. Tywin saw the eastern flank collapse at the 40-minute mark. Not collapse, thin. The word collapse implied a failure, and what happened on the eastern flank was not a failure of the men holding it, but a consequence of terrain that had not been visible in the maps and had only become visible from his position on the ridge, watching. Which was why he was on the ridge watching rather than in the line fighting. A ravine, perhaps 100 yards east of the mapped position, hidden under a winter's accumulation of snow and ice. The dead were moving through it. Had been moving through it for perhaps 20 minutes before the depth of the eastern flank began to thin in the specific way that meant pressure from an angle rather than from the front. He had not told anyone about the ravine contingency, not because he distrusted his commanders, because a plan that 2 men knew was a plan. A plan that 12 men knew was information. And information leaked through the seams of an army the way water leaked through stone, slowly and inevitably and at the worst possible moment. He had prepared the ravine response alone and carried it in his head and told no one, and he deployed it now with 3 words to his cavalry courier. Eastern Channel. Now, 800 heavy cavalry. Lannister and Reach Knights. Moved through the prepared route that Tywin had walked personally 2 days before the army arrived. They came out of the tree line east of the ravine at an angle that the dead did not expect. Because the dead did not expect, they responded to what was in front of them, which was the vanguard, and the cavalry came from the side. Robb Stark, fighting in the eastern section of the vanguard when the cavalry arrived, did not understand where they had come from for approximately 10 seconds. Then, he understood. He looked back at the ridge, at the single-mounted figure on the gray horse that had not moved from its position in the 2 hours since the battle began. He had no time to form a complete thought about this. He went back to fighting. She came from the dark between 2 burning trenches, which was where she had been for the last 40 minutes. Arya Stark was 11 years old. She had been in the Riverlands for the past year, surviving on the roads after escaping King's Landing. Too young to be taken seriously, and too quick to be caught. Moving through occupied towns and hostile crossings with the specific invisibility of a child that no one thinks to look for. The Red Wedding's cancellation had changed the Riverlands around her without her knowing why. Lannister soldiers who had been hunting moved differently, less urgently, as if their orders had shifted towards something other than pursuit. She had found her way north when the forces began to move, attaching herself to the column the way she had always attached herself to things, without asking, without explaining, presenting herself as a fact rather than a request. She had been at the wall for 3 days before the cold arrived. She moved through the camp the way she had always moved through rooms, present but not accounted for. Watching, taking stock of things the grown men with their maps and their commands did not notice, because they were looking at larger things, and she had always known that the largest things were rarely where the large men were looking. She had watched Tywin's briefing through a gap in the command tent's wall. She had watched the battle plans go up on the boards. She had seen the marking that Tywin had placed without annotation on the eastern edge of the battle map, a single mark, slightly apart from the others, that she recognized as the kind of mark a man made when he knew something he wasn't saying. She did not need to know what he knew. She had her own intelligence. The Night King stood behind his army. This was always where he stood, not in the line, not fighting, but directing, watching, managing a commander's position. Which meant that the way to him was not through his army but around it, through the seams, through the dark between the fires where the light did not reach. She moved through those seams for 20 minutes. Syrio Forel had told her once that a water dancer had no shadow, no footsteps, no eyes except forward. He had also told her that a true swordsman was ambidextrous in the way of water itself, that the blade was never loyal to one hand. She had practiced this in the yard at Winterfell until Bran had told on her. She had practiced it again in the corridors of the Red Keep until she had been fast enough not to get caught. She was fast enough now. She was fast enough for most things. She came at him from his left side, the blind approach, the angle no one used, because no one could get there without being seen. She had gotten there without being seen. He turned at the last moment. She had expected this. She dropped the blade from her right hand, caught it with her left. The Valyrian steel went in. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. Not quiet, loud, the loud of total absence, the way a sound defined itself by stopping. Across the field, the whites simply stopped, mid-motion, mid-stride, mid-attack. They stopped, and they fell. Thousands of them, all at once, like a word being unsaid. The field was very quiet for a long time. Robb Stark stood in a space that had been full of dead things, and was now full of things that were dead in the correct way. Still, inert, no blue light behind the eyes, no motion, just the north wind moving over them and the smoke from the burning trenches, and the sound, very slowly returning, of living men breathing. Grey wind pressed against his leg. The direwolf was unmarked. Robb put his hand on the wolf's head. He looked north. Just cold. Just winter. The tree line was still. The ravine was still. Nothing was coming down from the dark beyond the wall, and nothing would come down again, and Robb did not know yet whether to believe that. Could not quite place it inside the architecture of 3 years of loss that had built him into the man standing here. He looked at the ridge. The grey horse was still there. One mounted figure, still. He did not raise his hand. He did not call across the field. But he looked for a long moment at the man on the ridge who had built all of this. The food stores and the steel and the obsidian and the cavalry that had come from nowhere, because one man had walked a ravine alone in the dark 2 days before the battle, and then he looked away, back north, where there was nothing. Just cold. Just winter. Just the wind. The treaty took 11 days to write. Not because the terms were complex. Tywin had been carrying the terms in his head since the morning after the temporal fracture, arranged with the same precision he applied to everything, each clause load-bearing, each concession calculated to cost him less than it appeared, and to give the other party more than they expected. The 11 days were procedural. The seals, the witnesses, the maesters, the specific language that would survive 100 years of interpretation without collapsing into ambiguity. He had seen what ambiguous language in a treaty produced. He had seen it produce 3 generations of resentment in a single document. He wrote with the care of a man who understood that what he was writing would outlast him, which was the only standard he had ever held his work to. Robb Stark, king in the north, signed it on the 11th day. He came to King's Landing for the signing accompanied by the Blackfish, 2 Umberlords, and Grey Wind, who was not permitted inside the Red Keep, and sat in the outer courtyard for the duration with the expression of an animal that had decided it was going to wait and meant it. The document was laid on the council table. Robb read every line. He read slowly, the way his father had always read things, without performing impatience, without using speed to signal confidence. He asked 2 questions. Tywin answered both without elaboration. Then, Robb picked up the quill and signed. The North was a separate kingdom, formally recognized by the Iron Throne, by sealed treaty, in perpetuity. Not a gift, a recognition, which was different, which meant that what Robb had won in the field and held by blood was now also held in writing, and the writing bore Lannister gold. Robb looked at the document for a moment after signing it. Then, he said, "My father would not have believed this was possible." Tywin looked at him across the table. "Your father," he said, "would have refused to do what was necessary to make it possible. That is the difference between an honorable man and a useful one." He paused. "He was more honorable than I am. The realm required both of us." Robb said nothing for a moment. Then, he picked up his gloves from the table. "Talisa is expecting a child," he said. It was not a non sequitur. It was the thing he had come to say, the thing underneath the treaty, the actual content of the morning. "I thought you should know, since you've gone to the trouble of ensuring the North has a future." Tywin looked at him. "Then go home," he said. "Rebuild Winterfell. The North will need a functioning seat before the next winter." Robb nodded. He walked to the door. He stopped with one hand on the frame and said, "Without turning, I still don't trust you." "Good," Tywin said. "Don't." Tommen was 13 now, which meant the crown fit. They had made him a new one, slightly smaller, slightly lighter, designed for a boy who was going to be wearing it for a long time and who needed to be able to move his head without compensating. He wore it well, not with Joffrey's performance of authority, not with the self-consciousness of a child playing dress, but with the careful uprightness of someone who understood that the thing on his head was a responsibility rather than a decoration, and had decided to treat it accordingly. He sat at the head of the council table and listened to his hand. He asked questions when he did not understand. He said twice during the morning session that he wanted to think about something before deciding, which produced in Tyrion an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. After the council emptied, Tommen stayed. He sat with the attendance reports from the eastern granaries spread before him, reading them with the concentrated attention he brought to everything. And he said, "Without looking up, Lord Tyrion, do you think the rationing will need to be extended into the spring?" "Possibly," Tyrion said. "The winter's been shorter than projected, but shorter than projected is still long. We'll know more by the third moon." Tommen nodded. He made a note. He was 13 years old and he was taking notes on grain rationing, and he did not find this tedious, which was the most promising thing about him. "My lord," he said after a moment, "is my grandfather well?" Tyrion looked at him. "He is working," he said, which is the only metric he recognizes. Tommen accepted this. He went back to his reports. The chair was empty when Tyrion arrived. Not the room. Tywin was at the window, standing, which he almost never did in the evenings. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked at King's Landing below, the way he had stood at this window for 3 years, managing a kingdom one letter at a time, and something in the set of his shoulders was different from how it had been 3 years ago, different from how it had been 8 months ago, different in a way that Tyrion could not immediately name, and then could. He was finished. Not dead. He was standing, breathing. His mind was producing its usual rapid and merciless assessment of everything visible through the window. But the particular quality of forward pressure that had animated every room Tywin Lannister had ever occupied, the sense that the man was always moving towards something, always 3 steps ahead of the present moment, was quieter now. Not gone. Quieter, Tyrion set 2 cups on the desk. He poured Arbor Gold into both. He carried one to his father and held it out without speaking. Tywin took it. He looked at the cup. He did not drink yet. "The treaty is filed," Tyrion said. "The Tarly boy wants to return to the wall. I've recommended him for First Ranger." The acting commander agreed without hesitation, which is the first time anything north of the neck has agreed with anything I've recommended without complaint or delay. I'm choosing to interpret it as progress. He paused. "The Dragonstone obsidian production will continue at current levels for 2 more years. After that, the Westerland's forge masters want to return to commissioned work. I've told them 2 years. 3, Tywin said. 3, Tyrion agreed. Silence below. A cart moved through the cobblestones. Someone was calling to someone else across a street. The ordinary sound of a city that was still there, still functioning, still full of people going about the business of being alive, which was the only business that mattered. "I'm stepping back from the hand's chair," Tywin said. Tyrion looked at him. "Not immediately. After the rationing review in the third moon, when the Northern Reconstruction assessment is complete." He looked at the city below. "There are still things that require my attention before I can hand them to someone else without creating problems. And after," Tyrion said, carefully, in the tone of a man navigating terrain he could not fully see. "After," Tywin said, "the hand's chair will require someone who reads fast enough to be useful." He turned from the window. He looked at his son with the directness he had always reserved for things that mattered. "I am putting you in it formally. Not as acting hand. Not as temporary hand. Hand of the king. Under seal, before the full council." Tyrion looked at his cup. He looked at his father. He thought about 26 years, about a childhood spent understanding that the most intelligent man in any room he entered had made the calculation, long ago, that intelligence in the wrong body was a liability to be managed, rather than an asset to be used. He thought about what it had cost him and what it had cost his father, the waste of it. All those years the engine had been running in the wrong direction. He poured wine into his father's cup, which was still full. Then he said, "You could have done this 20 years ago." Tywin picked up the cup. He looked at it for a moment. "No," he said. "I couldn't." He did not explain. He did not need to. Tyrion understood. Understood that 20 years ago the thing that was coming had not been visible, and that without the thing that was coming there had been no reason that Tywin Lannister could have articulated, even to himself, to give the dwarf the chair. The emergency had created the opening the man had never been capable of creating on his own. Some things required the end of the world to become possible. Tyrion raised his cup, his father raised his. They did not toast, they simply drank, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The report from Castle Black arrived on a Tuesday. Jon Snow, named Lord Commander of the Night's Watch by unanimous election of the surviving brothers, wrote in his characteristic hand, direct, slightly cramped. The hand of a man who had learned to write as a tool rather than as an art. The wall stood. The wildling settlement in the Gift was progressing with the specific friction of people who had spent 10,000 years being enemies being asked to share a border, but progressing. The obsidian stores were sufficient. The garrison, supplemented by Tyrell volunteers and 600 Westerlands men who had followed the campaign north and not gone home, was the largest the Night's Watch had fielded in 2 centuries. "The cold has retreated," Jon wrote at the end. Not gone. The north is never without cold. But it has retreated to where it belongs, behind the wall, where it has always been, where we have always known it was. We are watching. We will keep watching. That is what we are for. Tywin set the report down. He poured a cup of arbor gold. He looked at the candle on his desk, the way he had looked at a candle 8 months ago when the world had been rearranged inside his head in the space of a few seconds. The same room. The same desk. The same man. Not the same problem. He picked up the cup. He did not hold it over the candle. He did not set it down. He sat for a moment in the quiet of a tower in a city that was still standing, in a kingdom that had, against every reasonable expectation, survived itself long enough to survive what had come for it. Then he drank. A lion does not concern himself with the opinions of sheep, but he ensures the flock survives the winter. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.